It is 4 o'clock on Monday, May 19th, 2025, and this is the Great War Discussion Group. We have David Pendleton talking today about something which should interest all of us. Specifically, was there really a Schlieffen Plan? Now, this may seem silly because there have been books and symposia, and there may even be an academic journal on the Schlieffen Plan. But did it really exist, and was it really a plan? David, you are on.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. As I guess you could say, I'm a historian from way back when, and I always thought there was a Schlieffen Plan until I started doing some research for my master's degree and ran across this one retired colonel, and from there I read a bunch more and changed my opinion, and maybe I can change some of yours. So, first of all, let's talk about Schlieffen. I mean, the interesting thing about this is that they had mandatory military service in Prussia, and he was only going to do his 1 year of service, and then he was going to be a lawyer. And at the end of his 1 year, he was selected to be an officer candidate, and then he stuck around and made it a career after that. He served in the Franco-Prussian War with a small force, and then when his wife died, he basically became his military was basically all he cared about after that. There's his time as a general, and in August 1905, he was kicked by a companion's horse, and I guess that made him ineligible to serve because of his whatever happened to him. So if that hadn't happened, he might have been serving a little bit longer than what he did when he left in the end of 1905, started 1906. And the other major character that we'll be discussing is the guy who came up with a new thesis, and that guy is Terence Zuber. And Terence Zuber is a retired colonel from the U.S. Army. You can see his bio there. He speaks and reads 3 languages, and he spent 3 years with the Germans as a liaison officer. And so he does lots of research in first-hand documents and not just second-hand documents. And when he came out with his thesis in late 1999 or so, late 1990s, he turned the European historians on their head when he said there was no Schlieffen Plan. And this was his thesis that he had to begin with. And the plan that was written, or the document was written by Schlieffen, assumed only a one-front war against France alone. There was no other allies for the allies with the Prussia or Germany, and there was no other enemy other than France. And the plan would assume German army would have a bunch of divisions that they did not have. In 1906, when the document was written, the army only had 72 divisions, and in 1914, it only had 68 divisions on the Western Front. The remaining few divisions were on the Eastern Front. And in this document, it was written that the Germans attacked if they moved southeast of Paris. They would be stopped on one of the rivers like that. So to make this plan work, they would have to go west of Paris, and they'd have to have 24 divisions that did not exist and 28 divisions that were not available in 1914. And as we all know, that the German army was stopped in 1914 in the fall on the Marne River. So here's a map that is seen a lot of times. In the actual document that was written, there was no map that accompanied it. All the maps were based on verbiage that somebody made up later. So the lines were by the map maker, not by anybody on the German general staff. So how did this all happen? Well, in 1999, Zuber had an article published in War and History, and this is what started a 14-year debate, and actually might still be going on to some extent. And the debate was occurring in various historical journals, mainly War and History, but there were some other ones that were also involved in it. I'm going to go over some of these. Some of them will be pretty fast. Others I'll slow down for. I hope to keep this under about 35 minutes or so we have time for questions at the end. Okay. His first article was published in 1999, and one of his statements is that the Schlieffen Plan has become so well known that it's common knowledge, and it required no verification. So nobody ever went back to the actual German documents and looked to see if there really was a Schlieffen Plan. And the plan was aggressive, and it would defeat France in approximately 42 days. And this plan proves German war guilt. Now, if you ever looked at France's and Russia's war plans, they both had an offensive mindset. So therefore, but that didn't make them guilty of the war. Now, what the German called this article that was written by Schlieffen is a Denkschrift, or memorandum. And the memo is not a plan, but it was written to argue for a massive increase in the size of the army. Because the German military was building up their naval fleet to compete with Great Britain, they could only conscript about 2/3 of their 18-year-olds into the army. And lots of people, including Schlieffen, wanted 100% conscription. You do your 2 years, and then you go to the first reserve, where you serve 3 weeks every summer with your regiment. Now, this memorandum was actually written in 1906 after Schlieffen had retired, but they backdated it to before his retirement date to try to make it have more weight. As I said before, the memo assumed only a one-front war against France without any Russia support, and the memo required 96 divisions at the time, and there was only 72 in the entire German army at the time. And then Zuber went through every war plan that Schlieffen was involved with since 1891, and up to 1904, there was no trace of a Schlieffen Plan. And no war game ever was conducted that used anything that resembled the Schlieffen Plan as people come to know it. So this article generates a response from Terrence Holmes, a British historian who's a German expert. He did agree that Schlieffen wrote the plan after he retired, and the strong right wing was to envelop the enemy wherever it was encountered. It didn't matter whether this was east or west of Paris. It didn't matter. The focus was the French army and nothing else. He said the German army was too weak in 1914 to implement this plan. And then he also agreed that it was part of the reason for it was to build up the German army. And then Moltke adopted a variant of the plan in 1911, and then he even modified that in 1914 for his opening campaign on the Western Front. Now, in response to this, Zuber once again repeats some of the same arguments, but he said that over 75 years, this has become common knowledge, or Holmes claimed to become common knowledge, but he doesn't cite any original sources. All he cites is secondary sources. And the plan contained those 24 ghost divisions that never existed. And all the maps that have ever been published on the Schlieffen Plan always show an attack west of Paris. So if that's the map, that's the plan. So Holmes saying it didn't matter was probably not being realistic. Now, German intelligence in 1914 estimated the Russian army as effective, and so that in 1914 there was no doubt that they were going to face a two-front war. So there's no chance that there's only going to be a one front war against France in 1914. And Zuber said Schlieffen and Moltke never tested the Schlieffen Plan in any war game. And in all of Schlieffen's war games, and he went back and looked at every one of them, the French always attacked first, and the Germans counterattacked against the French, usually overextension. Now, there's a guy named William Dickman, who was a German military officer between the wars in the 1920s. And a manuscript he began to write was a detailed look at each of the war plans from 1891 to 1914. And in that manuscript, there is no trace of the Schlieffen Plan, and the project was actually stopped by the German army because it was going to interfere with their with the script that they wanted to say that if Moltke had just followed the Schlieffen Plan, they would have won the war. So this gets Holmes to come back again, and his response to Zuber this time is, well, the Germans would, if Schlieffen had been there, they would have got their 96 divisions somehow. And in 1906, the Russians were reeling from their loss to Japan and were not available to attack. And he says the last exercises that he used, the last couple of them, when he was chief of the German General Staff, they were the predecessors of the Schlieffen Plan. And the actual Dinscript is his final culminating thinking of how to defeat the French in a war. Zuber once again responds. And once again, it's the attack's supposed to be west of Paris, not east. And the 96 divisions couldn't be. It takes time to build up a division, and they weren't going to have a time to do that. And in 1906, a one-front war was highly unlikely because Russia had sent 10 corps to Siberia. They still had 16 corps on the west facing Germany, so they could have still fought on the Eastern Front. And none of Schlieffen's war games bared any resemblance to Schlieffen's plan, as France always attacked first in those plans. And then he wrote the plan after the retirement, not before. And Moltke never made the Schlieffen Plan, the German war plan. Okay, this is when another guy got involved named Foley. His name is Robert Foley. He cites an 1899 war plan as the predecessor of the Schlieffen Plan, and that the plan could not be implemented until new fortifications at Metz had been completed by the Germans. Well, Zuber comes back at him. The 1899 plan was only effective for 6 months. Each year, the German General Staff wrote 2 plans. Each plan was in effect for 6 months. So that one plan was only in effect for 6 months, and then it went away. All the German divisions they had in the army had to be deployed in the West for this to work. So they would have none facing Russia. And the strong right wing in some of these plans had the same amount as the center and the left, which 30 divisions. And the plan in 1899 was replaced with a new plan that put 10 divisions in East Prussia and 58 divisions in the West, the exact number of divisions that the German army had at the time. And then Schlieffen looked specifically in the Schlieffen Plan in the Den script that this had nothing to do with any fortresses at Metz. So evidently, this individual did not read the original German Den script. So Holmes comes back at Zuber again and says, okay. He called it 87 divisions on the right total, but that's less than the number needed in reality. And Holmes stated that 13 corps would march to the west of Paris to push the French against the Swiss border, but they didn't have them. They were ghost divisions. And Moltke's attack with 54 divisions the right wing was still the Schlieffen Plan because the French had weakened their position. So he said it was the plan, even though it was nothing like the original document. Terence Zuber, of course, replied to this article, and the magazine refused to publish it, though. And this is where they get a little snippy at Zuber. In fact, they invite him to a conference, and they have him go first and give 30 minutes, and then they have about 8 guys come after him and give them each 30 or 40 minutes to poke holes in his theory, and Zuber never got a chance to come back. And when they published the articles from that conference, they left out Zuber's at the same time. So Foley comes back in War and History, and his response is Wilhelm Dickmann, who's the German member of the historical department in the Reichswehr. That's the German army between the wars. Well, he said there was a Schlieffen Plan, so there must have been one. And then he said that the plan was never used in his war games to test war plans. And then the Russian weakness in 2006 allowed Schlieffen to adopt his one-front war plan. And he could have raised the forces necessary to do this. And the deterioration of Germany's position on the eastern and western fronts forced Moltke to implement a modified plan in 1914. And then he comes at Zuber and says, oh, you're doing all this because you like Germany and you worked with the German army, in the 80s, and you want to prove that Germany fought a defensive war. Well, Zuber comes back, and this time they do publish his response. And he says that Foley has changed his mind because in 2003 he said one thing, and then 4 years later he said something else. And then he said the one exception was the general staff ride in 1905. And Ludendorff said that's where they tested the plan. Just so happened to be Ludendorff was dead at this time. And so, well, by the 20s. And so he wasn't around to say anything at all. And, but he actually made no such statement about testing the plan. And Dickman never described the Schlieffen Plan's detail at all in his writings. And Foley never explains how the plan could be written for one front war and had to be executed a two-front war with 24 missing divisions. And Foley's focus is to continue to maintain the German war guilt by whatever means necessary, and this has nothing to do with Zuber's thesis. And Russia's mobilization forced Germany's mobilization. Now, this part is true, is that the Germans knew that Russia mobilized slowly, but every day they did not mobilize gave the Russians an extra day ahead of them. Now, this is when another historian gets involved. Her name is Annika Mombauer. And she says the Schlieffen Plan shows the Germans are guilty of starting the war. It was aggressive and it led to the invasion of France. And France and Russia agreed to march into Germany by the 15th day of Russian mobilization. The Germans were always, the Germans were supposed to be deep into French territory, making a French offensive highly unlikely. If that's if the Schlieffen Plan was actually as they said it was. The German troops invaded Luxembourg and Belgium and were headed to France. And the French president ordered the French army, to halt within 10 kilometers of the French-German border. Now, the thing about her, she never looked at any of the actual war planning documents, but she used secondary sources and common knowledge and truthfulness, whatever that is, in her writing. Something that a lot of people do not know is that the first battle on the Western Front was not fought in France, but was fought on German territory. The first battle on the Eastern Front was not fought in Russian territory, but on German territory. Of the four great land powers, that's Germany, France, Russia, and Austro-Hungary, the Germans were the last to begin major offensive operations in the war. The German army never planned to be in the French territory by the 15th day of mobilization. That's what the French thought was going to happen. In fact, the German rail deployment would not end until 17th of August. And Poincaré resented his 10-kilometer order on 2 August 1914, so that 10-kilometer zone that she cited was really overdone with. And the French Plan 17, that was their plan. And I've read that plan when I was working on my thesis. It was offensive in nature. They were going to attack Germany and take back their two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. So that was just offensive. They were going to go on the offense. They can't attack anybody but France over there. So another guy, a German historian named Gerhard Gross, he comes up with 9 criticisms of Zuber's thesis. I'll have you take a look at those. A lot of these are the same that the other ones used. And then we'll look at Zuber's response to each of these on the next slide. And by the way, Rose says that he strictly adhered to the Schlieffen Plan. Okay. I shortened the criticisms on this one. Oh, here's the conclusions of Gross summarized. The Punk in number 4, that means that is the major place that the decision of the battle is going to take place. Now, these are Gross's. So this is what Gross wrote, not what other people wrote. This is what he says. So on the next one, Zuber's counter arguments. Gross said there were many copies of the plan, and they were distributed to various places. But one of the copies of the plan was in the hands of Schlieffen's daughters. If the plan was top secret, how come his daughters had a copy of it? This would have been in 1906 or 7 when he died, 1913. When he died in 1913. And Schlieffen only planned counterattacks if he was numerically inferior. Gross never explained how Germany was numerically superior against a combined force of France and Russia. He also said, this is Gross, the war games and staff riots had nothing to do with his strategic thought. They were used for staff training and promotion tests. But if you look at the Battle of Tannenberg in the 1894 war game, it was almost an exact template for the Battle of Tannenberg. So that contradicts Gross's statement that they were not used for preparing for war. And saying the 1905 General Staff Ride was where Schlieffen used to test his plan, well, that just contradicted his previous argument. Gross said that if the DIN script was so important, why wasn't it given to the Kaiser or the war minister? Well, Zuber said it wasn't important in 1914 as much as it was in the 1920s, because that's when the post-war fabrication plan began. And Gross said that the plan, as written, had missing equipment, primarily mortars, and missing equipment and divisions are not the same. That's what Zuber says. You can't be missing 24 to 34 divisions, and that's not the same as an equipment shortage. And then he basically also said the Germans' divisions were just that much better than the French, and but that doesn't work because the DIN script said that 97 divisions were not enough to flank Paris. So once again, Gross contradicted his previous arguments with the next one, like that. And Dickman's thesis was that this is Gross saying that Dickman's thesis was that Moltke changed his war plan to suit changes in German political planning. Well, Dickman's boss in the 1920s took him to task for suggesting that Schlieffen's 1894 East Front planning ran counter to German foreign policy. And then at that point, his boss was a guy named General Forster. General Forster at that point in time shut down Dickman from continuing his review of Schlieffen's war plans because he didn't want them to contradict their plan, that the Schlieffen Plan was infallible. So, in summary, after 8 years of arguments going back and forth, Holmes finally conceded Terence Zuber's central point that the Schlieffen Plan was not the German war plan in 1914. However, he did not concede that there was never a Schlieffen Plan. The extra divisions necessary to conduct the Schlieffen Plan either existed in 1906 or that Schlieffen thought he could raise them. Therefore, Schlieffen could have executed the Schlieffen Plan in 1906. Well, of course, Zuber comes back at him. Doesn't matter. Schlieffen wasn't in the army anymore, so he couldn't do anything. And so the Schlieffen's plan was only viable, would have only been viable for 6 months anyway, even if it had been a plan. But it had a lot of could haves and would haves, and none that ever happened. So this comes up. This is another map of the Schlieffen Plan. You can find all sorts of maps on the internet. There's the swing west of Paris, like that, and then of course they didn't swing west. So this is this is a summary, and this is my conclusions. My conclusions only, nobody else. My conclusion was I reversed my line of thinking. I always thought there was a Schlieffen Plan for about 40 years. And now I do not believe there was one. It was written after he was no longer the chief of staff. It was backdated to make it look more powerful, give it more weight. A copy was given to his daughters. So if it was classified document, why is his daughters getting a copy of it? And it was used to try to convince to increase German manpower on active duty. And then the daughters handed over their copy to the Weimar government, or to the Weimar government in 1931. Moltke might have started with the Schlieffen Plan or that thing, but he always used current war plans based on the current political situation. And those are modified over time based on how many divisions they had, who their allies were, and everything else. And so therefore, it might have had a little resemblance to some of what it is, but any plan is going to have a little resemblance to the previous plan that was probably written. Moltke's initial plan was to defend on the Eastern Front and counterattack France on the West. That's the reason he put 7/8 of his army on the Western Front and only 1/8 on the Eastern Front. They're going to use the interior lines, railroads, to move units from east to west, west to east as needed. Now, the Germans initially had some success on the right flank, but things were a little dicey on the Eastern Front. So Moltke made the decision to take 3 corps, 6 divisions from the right wing, put them on trains, and send them to the Eastern Front. This reduced the strength of the main attack on the right flank. The corps could have come from the left flank, as they were the closest to the railheads, but those corps were Bavarian corps. The Prussians did not believe that the Bavarians would fight for East Prussia, so they usually kept them down south for the most part. So it took a while for those to march to the railroad stations and get on board. And by the time the units arrived in East Prussia, both major battles were done there, and the Germans had been victorious. And then, of course, we know Moltke was sacked for his failure to defeat France. And when Germany lost, they needed to find a scapegoat. So the Reichswehr also needed to find a scapegoat. Moltke died in 1916. We already said that Schlieffen had died. So the Reichswehr kept a lock on all the World War I documents from the war, and they let in people that towed the party line to look at them. And so they developed this theme that if Moltke had only followed the Schlieffen Plan, Germany would have won the war quickly. And then they were writing this manuscript about all the war plans, and the guy that was writing those got told to stop because he probably figured out that the Schlieffen Plan was not going to be the end all be all of the planning, and so therefore they just halted the plan. Historians, especially the ones in the interwar years, were limited to the documents they could reach, and they were only allowed access to the ones that supported the infallible Schlieffen Plan. And then this continued from 1919 to 1939, and then World War II happened, and the archives, the German archives, got bombed, and most of the documents got lost. And eventually the Schlieffen Plan and its invincibility became common knowledge to all, including historians who didn't go searching for any answers beyond what somebody else had already written. And then map makers, including the ones in the Westport Atlas of World War I, they began producing maps of what they thought was the Schlieffen Plan, but really it was what they thought the plan was, not really anything that was Schlieffen, because as I said, Schlieffen had never ever drew a map related to this. And in 1999, Zuber shook up this common thinking with the publication that there was never a Schlieffen Plan, and Zuber's critics came out of the woodwork. And he has debated these in the different magazines or periodicals. And when it looked like he was winning the debates, the other ones seemed to do things to try to shut him up by at that conference not letting him rebut anybody, and also not publishing articles like that. They would publish the one side, but not his side of the story type thing. Then after the reunification of Germany in 1990, they actually found some documents, and most of these supported Zuber's claims. And Holmes, who's his sharpest critic, finally agreed that that the plan in 1914 was not the Schlieffen Plan, but he still has yet to agree that there is no Schlieffen Plan. And there's still debate going over his thesis, with new evidence still being found in Germany. Now, Zuber has not changed his position. He still says there was no Schlieffen Plan, and any information he finds continues to support his theory. I know this was down and dirty, a lot of information, but these are some of the books that I looked at that are used for this. Most of these are Zuber's, except for the one on the right. The one on the right is the one from the conference, and they didn't even publish Zuber's. They published everybody else's paper from that conference except Zuber's in it. And here's a list of sources. And now it's time to shoot me down with your questions. And I'll try to answer them as well as I can.
Thank you, David, for while everybody is kind of mulling that one over and thinking about questions. Let me ask you this. What you're saying essentially is that the Schlieffen Plan was kind of invented as a straw man in the 1920s to explain how the Germans failed so badly during the initial months of the war.
Well, how come they didn't defeat the France in 6 weeks? Like that, yes. Like
Well,
that.
now
Why
Patrick
did
is going
they
to talk about,
lose? Yeah, Charlie.
no, Patrick's going to talk about that in a couple of months,
Yeah.
and I don't want to preempt that. But without getting into the actual operational details of why they lost, uh, what was the motive for maintaining that this semi-mythical Schlieffen Plan existed and that the Germans lost the war because they didn't do it right?
Well, I mean, they had to find a scapegoat, so they actually found 3 scapegoats from the war. One was Moltke the Younger for not following the plan. The second one was the colonel that told the First Army to retreat, like that, when there was a gap between the First and Second Army, and then there was a third scapegoat. So I'm trying like that. But basically, they were trying to come up with a reason why they lost the war, because uh, I mean, the German people have been told all through the war that the Germans were winning, and they never saw an Allied soldier on their territory until after the armistice. And so there was thinking in both probably psychologically for the people and in the German army, is that, why did this happen, and like that. So it must be because we didn't follow the plan that was laid out for us. And during the inner years, the Versailles Treaty allowed the German army only 100,000 soldiers, 4,000 officers, and 96,000 enlisted soldiers. Most of those enlisted soldiers, a lot of those 96,000 enlisted soldiers had been officers who chose to go to become a sergeant to remain in the military, like that. So there was a lot of educated German soldiers throughout the army, and they're still trying to wrestle with is, how come we lost? And so the historical department, don't know if they did this on their own. There was nothing that Zuber said, is this a plan from the top of the Reichswehr, or if this was the historical department trying to do this, but they had to come up with a reason why the German army lost, and so they put the blame on Moltke the Younger for not following the Schlieffen Plan, and this became a myth that was picked up by historians, and nobody ever went down and dug into the archives until Zuber came along, and with his ability to read German, and looking at every year of the war plans and everything, he saw that there was no transitioning into the Schlieffen Plan in 1905-06, and then the changes coming up to 14. There was really no connection to that. Actually, during some of those war plans that were good for 6 months, the plan was to attack Russia first and defend against France. It usually was only for a 6-month period or a year, when they always went back to, we got to defeat France first because Russia's going to take longer time to mobilize. And so that became the default for most of their war plans.
All right. Anyone else have questions?
David, I'm just going to ask this. This is Ken.
Okay.
It sounds like in the heat of argument and defending his thesis that Zuber got to the point of wanting to, deny that the Germans were the aggressors. Is that what evolved, or does he accept that the Germans?
I mean, there have been other historians that they had to accept the war guilt clause. They had no, I mean, it was an armistice, but I mean, they'd taken over all, they had to give up 85,000 train engines. And in other words, they couldn't restart the war again. So they had to accept whatever the Allies put on them. So there was a war guilt clause that they started the war, and the Schlieffen Plan was the reason why. But as I said, the Russian war plan was offensive in nature. The French Plan 17 was offensive in nature. So having an offensive plan is not in and of itself a sign that you started the war. Like that. Some people say it was the blank check given to Austria-Hungary that, yeah, you do whatever you want to Serbia and we'll back you, type thing. So that's another reason that the Germans were supposed to take for the war guilt clause, is that they backed Austria-Hungary 100%, whatever they did.
Well, I mean, the invasion of Belgium sure gives some credibility to the fact there was a plan that wanted to go around,
Sure,
get Paris.
Sure, because France had fortresses all along their common border with Germany. In fact, they attacked out of those and were crossed into German land first, like that. So the French attacked first, and the first battles of the Western Front were fought in Germany. Yeah, and then they decided to go to the right flank because that's where the French was not, type thing. And so they did break the neutrality of Belgium. That's no doubt about that, type thing. There's no doubt they did that. But usually attack.
Hey, thanks. That was thought-provoking.
Okay, anybody else have questions? I don't see anybody.
Dan Turner.
Yeah.
Okay. This is perhaps slightly off topic, but I guess I've read that after Russia mobilized, the Kaiser was talking to the general staff and said, why can't we just attack Russia? Why do we need to attack France? They haven't done anything yet. And supposedly the answer was, well, we've got these plans and we can't change them. The railroad timetables are such as what they are. We have no other plan. I mean, it just kind of boggles my mind that there seemed to be one single plan in response to, I guess, about any situation.
Prior to the Kaiser taking power, Germany had a reassurance treaty with Russia, and that's because they did not want to fight a two-front war. But the Kaiser didn't like Russia, so therefore they decided in 1890 to let that treaty lapse. And within a couple of years, Russia signed a treaty with France that said, if Germany attacks you, we'll come to your aid, and vice versa. And so now almost any war was going to be two-front. And because of Russia's vast territory, it would take a lot longer to end that war than against France in a smaller area. So we always hear 6 weeks, 42 days. The Schlieffen Plan never ever said anything about time. It was just that the 42 days comes from that the German intelligence thinks that it will take 42 days for the Russians to mobilize and to get into its first battle. So therefore, they need to defeat France so they can send some of their troops to the East Front, because they only had 1/8 of their troops there to begin with. And it just so happened the Russians were so inept that the Germans beat them in 2 battles before any of those reinforcements showed up from the Western Front, like that. But actually, the Russians attacked sooner than 42 days, I believe. So the estimate of 42 days by the German staff was even wrong. And going back to the railroad thing, it's just not easy to reroute. I mean, they had a plan by the transportation department, and the transportation department in the German General Staff is one of the bigger ones, because they had a plan, that once the balloon goes up, you know, these railroad cars are going here and picking up this and that. And so there was no, they just couldn't change it like the Kaiser wanted, because it would just create chaos in the thing. It would take days to replan and reroute all those, and that's days that the German army didn't have to before the battles would begin. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, only I guess if I was the Kaiser, I would have I mean, before the war said, well, let's have a plan A and a plan B. So maybe plan A is just attack Russia, if that's what it boils
they
down.
they did have some of those during the years like that, but they usually didn't last long, because once France and Russia became friendly and had their treaty, that was if one was attacked, the other was coming to its aid. So there was no chance it was not going to be a two-front war. So therefore, it just so happened. Normally, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to declare war and then mobilize. That's the way you used to do it in the gentlemanly armies. But if you look, Russia mobilized, and then Germany declared war and started mobilizing, and then France started mobilizing, but they didn't declare war. So Russia and France mobilized, which meant they were going to war. They just never officially declared it by their legislatures that they were going to war. Well, Germany declared war first and then mobilized.
David, thank you very much. That was
Like that.
interesting, entertaining, and challenging.
I'll leave you with a quote from Liddell Hart. I don't know the exact quote, but this is close enough to it, and I think this pertains to most of us also. The only thing more difficult than to get an old idea out of a general's head is to get a new idea into it. In other words, most people are not willing to change their way they think for whatever reason. And in this case, I have changed my way, I think, on this issue. So
Well,
it does happen every once in a while.
I will also close with a quote, and this one goes back to Roman times, although I don't know the Latin for it, but it goes, "Truth is the first casualty in any war."
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for